Venezuela was once considered one of the wealthiest oil nations in the world. With proven oil reserves exceeding those of Saudi Arabia, the country seemed destined for prosperity. Experts estimate that if Venezuela could fully extract and monetize its oil, the total value could exceed $5 trillion. Yet, despite this incredible resource, the Venezuelan population struggles with basic necessities like food, medicine, and electricity. How could a nation so rich in natural resources fall so deeply into economic and humanitarian crises? The answer lies in what experts now call the oil trap, a complex web of economic mismanagement, political corruption, and over-reliance on oil revenues, from which Venezuela is now struggling to escape. The story begins in the early 20th century, when oil was first discovered in Venezuela. Initially, the discovery was celebrated as a blessing. Foreign companies, particularly American oil giants, arrived to build refineries and injected massive capital into the economy. Oil exports skyrocketed, and Venezuela rapidly became one of Latin America's most stable and prosperous nations. Citizens felt confident that oil would secure their future. However, beneath the surface, a silent danger was emerging. The country was becoming dangerously dependent on a single resource. This dependency is known as the resource curse. Over the decades, agriculture, manufacturing, and technology sectors were neglected as the government's attention and revenue focused almost entirely on oil. When oil money flowed easily, there was little incentive to diversify the economy. Venezuela became a one-resource economy, vulnerable to fluctuations in global oil prices. This single-minded reliance on oil would prove catastrophic when the global market shifted. The crisis deepened during Hugo Chávez's presidency. Chávez nationalized the oil industry and promised that oil wealth would directly benefit the people. At first, his policies were extremely popular. Poverty rates fell, and social programs like free healthcare and education expanded rapidly. But behind this apparent success lay a dangerous pattern. The government prioritized short-term political gains over long-term economic sustainability. Oil revenues were spent quickly on social programs and subsidies, rather than invested in infrastructure, savings, or diversification. When oil prices were high, the system seemed stable. But when global oil prices fell, Venezuela's economy had no safety net. The collapse of oil prices in the 2010s sent Venezuela into a downward spiral. Instead of using reserves or savings to stabilize the economy, the government resorted to printing more money, fueling hyperinflation. Currency devaluation reached historic levels, making wages insufficient even for basic food purchases. Supermarket shelves went empty and citizens were forced to cross borders in search of essential goods. The wealth that oil once promised had turned into a source of suffering. Compounding the problem were international sanctions. Oil is not just an economic asset in Venezuela, it is also a political weapon. The United States and Europe imposed sanctions targeting the government, but the real victims were ordinary citizens. Restricted exports cut national income even further, accelerating the economic collapse. This created a vicious cycle. Less revenue led to deeper crisis, which then prompted more sanctions, further destabilizing the country. Meanwhile, global powers such as China and Russia entered the picture. They provided Venezuela with loans and technical support in exchange for future oil deliveries. These loans served as temporary relief, but added another layer to the oil trap. A significant portion of Venezuela's future oil revenue was already pledged to foreign creditors. Even if oil prices recovered, the profits would largely go to repay these debts rather than benefit Venezuelan citizens. The country's natural wealth had effectively been mortgaged away. This scenario illustrates the true nature of the $5 trillion oil trap. Venezuela possesses the world's largest oil reserves, yet it is unable to leverage them for the well-being of its people. Infrastructure is crumbling, refineries are offline, and skilled workers have fled abroad. Extracting and selling oil has become increasingly difficult and expensive, making the potential wealth largely inaccessible. Foreign investment is required to revive production. Such investment will not occur without political stability, something Venezuela currently lacks, which many observers mistakenly assume that Venezuela has already reached the peak of its crisis. In reality, what the country faces is an ongoing process of collapse, not a single event. When a nation's economy, political system, and global positioning are all dependent on one resource, a crisis can continue for years or even decades. Venezuela remains trapped in this process, with no clear path to recovery. The social consequences of the collapse are severe. Hyperinflation, unemployment, and food shortages have destroyed the public health system. Hospitals lack basic medicine and fuel, and many doctors have emigrated. Children and the elderly are particularly vulnerable, with malnutrition and preventable diseases on the rise. This humanitarian crisis is not temporary. It is creating long-term generational impacts that will hinder Venezuela's recovery for decades. The regional consequences are also alarming. Millions of Venezuelans have fled to neighboring countries like Colombia and Brazil, placing enormous pressure on local infrastructure, healthcare, and education systems. Refugee flows have strained resources, increased border tensions, and contributed to the growth of organized crime. What began as a national economic crisis has evolved into a regional humanitarian and political challenge. Geopolitics further complicate the situation. Venezuela's oil is not just a local commodity, but a strategic asset on the global stage. Foreign powers carefully monitor developments because instability affects global energy markets and geopolitical influence. The US, Europe, China, and Russia all have a stake in how Venezuela's oil crisis unfolds, each seeking to protect their own economic and political interests. The oil trap is no longer just an economic problem. It is a geopolitical dilemma. The Venezuelan oil trap also demonstrates the consequences of mismanagement over time. Infrastructure is deteriorating, pipelines are damaged, and refineries are inefficient or offline. Even if oil reserves exist underground, extracting them has become prohibitively expensive. Skilled workers have fled, technology is outdated, and political instability discourages foreign investment. Venezuela's $5 trillion oil wealth remains largely unrealized, a theoretical asset rather than a practical source of prosperity. The irony is clear: even when global oil prices rise, Venezuela cannot capitalize on them. Decades of mismanagement, political short-termism, and corruption have created a situation in which oil wealth no longer translates into real benefit for the population. Instead, it fuels a cycle of poverty, dependency, and instability. Ultimately, $5 trillion oil trap is a warning not just for Venezuela, but for any resource-rich nation that relies heavily on a single commodity. Short-term prosperity, without long-term planning, can quickly turn into permanent disaster. Venezuela's experience demonstrates that natural wealth, without strategic management, can become a liability instead of a blessing. The collapse of Venezuela is far from over. As long as political instability, sanctions, and economic mismanagement persist, the oil trap will continue to ensnare the nation. The coming years will be critical. Either Venezuela finds a way to stabilize, diversify, and rebuild, or it will continue to descend into one of the most severe economic and humanitarian crises in modern history: the black market, sanctions, and the deepening crisis. Venezuela's economic collapse is no longer just a domestic issue. It has profound regional and global implications. The oil that once symbolized the country's wealth has now become its most dangerous liability. When international sanctions targeted the Venezuelan government and its oil exports, the country's national income plummeted. At the same time, an unregulated black market economy emerged to fill the void left by official systems. Ordinary citizens, struggling to access basic goods and services, were forced to rely on informal networks for survival. These networks operate outside of legal oversight, creating an economy that technically exists but functions in secrecy, feeding corruption and exploitation. Ironically, the very oil that was meant to provide wealth and stability is now a key driver of this illicit economy. The black market trade in oil and related goods is complex and far-reaching. With refineries offline and official export channels restricted, smugglers have become the main source of energy supply in Venezuela and neighboring countries. Much of this illegally traded oil reaches Caribbean and Latin American markets. In these transactions, government officials often take a cut, but the ordinary population sees little benefit. What initially seems like a lifeline for citizens is actually another form of entrapment. People are dependent on illegal networks for survival, which exposes them to exploitation, crime, and further instability. The black market, while temporarily sustaining the population, simultaneously entrenches systemic corruption and inefficiency. Sanctions imposed by the United States and Europe further complicate the situation. These measures aim to pressure the government, but their effects ripple far beyond political elites. Restricted exports reduce national income and cripple legitimate business, accelerating economic collapse. Venezuela's oil sector was once an essential part of the global market, and disruptions have caused fluctuations in oil prices worldwide. Europe and Asia, previously reliant on Venezuelan oil, are forced to seek alternative suppliers, often at higher costs. This instability in the supply chain can trigger broader energy shocks, affecting industries such as transportation, manufacturing, and agriculture across multiple continents. Political instability is another critical factor undermining recovery. Ongoing conflicts between the government and opposition parties make reform and foreign investment nearly impossible. International companies are hesitant to invest in refineries or extraction projects amid such unpredictability. The combination of illegal networks, failing infrastructure, and a hostile political environment creates a perfect storm where economic collapse feeds corruption, and corruption in turn perpetuates the collapse. The humanitarian consequences of this crisis are staggering. Hyperinflation, unemployment, and widespread food shortages have devastated public health systems. Hospitals lack basic medicines and fuel, while many healthcare professionals have emigrated. Children, the elderly, and vulnerable populations suffer the most. With malnutrition and preventable diseases becoming widespread, this crisis is not just immediate. It is reshaping Venezuela's demographic and social future, creating generational trauma that will persist long after oil production or political stability returns. Neighboring countries also bear the consequences of Venezuela's collapse. Millions of refugees have fled to Colombia, Brazil, and other nations, overwhelming infrastructure and public services. Education systems, healthcare facilities, and housing resources are under immense pressure. Border tensions have increased, and organized crime has exploited the situation. Venezuela's crisis has become a regional issue, demonstrating how the collapse of a single oil-dependent country can destabilize an entire part of the continent. The geopolitical dimension cannot be ignored. China and Russia have become heavily involved, providing loans and technical support in exchange for future oil deliveries. These interventions temporarily alleviate economic pressures, but deepen Venezuela's long-term entrapment. Large portions of future oil revenue are already pledged to foreign creditors, meaning that even if global oil prices rise, most benefits go to repay international loans rather than support the local population. Venezuela's natural wealth has been leveraged to satisfy foreign powers, further limiting domestic recovery. The oil trap also highlights the environmental and infrastructural consequences of decades of mismanagement. Refineries are outdated, pipelines are damaged, and skilled engineers have left the country. Even if the country could technically produce large quantities of oil, the costs and risks of extraction have skyrocketed. Foreign investment and modern technology are essential, but political instability and corruption continue to discourage external partners. In practical terms, Venezuela's $5 trillion in reserves remains largely theoretical, a figure on paper rather than a source of real wealth for its citizens. The irony is stark. Even when global oil prices rise, Venezuela cannot capitalize on them. Short-term political decision-making, decades of mismanagement, and systemic corruption have created a scenario where resource wealth translates into human suffering instead of prosperity. The black market thrives, corruption intensifies, and global markets feel the effects indirectly through price volatility and supply shocks. Venezuela's collapse is a warning for other resource-dependent nations. Over-reliance on a single commodity, without strategic investment or economic diversification, creates vulnerability. Short-term economic gains can easily turn into long-term crises. Venezuela demonstrates that natural wealth, if mismanaged, can become a trap rather than a lifeline, destabilizing not just the local economy, but also regional politics and international markets. Looking ahead, the situation remains precarious. Without immediate political reform, international cooperation, and economic restructuring, Venezuela's decline could continue. Rebuilding infrastructure, restoring production, and stabilizing social systems will take decades. Short-term measures can only provide temporary relief, leaving the population trapped in persistent hardship. In essence, the $5 trillion oil trap is not just a reflection of wealth mismanagement. It is a multi-layered crisis affecting social, economic, and geopolitical stability. The convergence of political instability, sanctions, black market dependence, and humanitarian collapse illustrates the complexity of Venezuela's oil trap. It is no longer just a question of economics. It is about the future of a nation and its people, the stability of a region, and the balance of global energy markets. Venezuela's story serves as a cautionary tale. Oil, when treated as a short-term resource rather than a foundation for sustainable development, can lead to decades of crisis, both internally and internationally. Global shockwaves and the long road ahead. Venezuela's crisis is no longer a national tragedy. It is a global, economic, and geopolitical concern. The collapse of one of the world's largest oil producers has rippling effects across continents. Oil, which once symbolized Venezuela's immense wealth, has become a trigger for instability in global energy markets. When production is restricted, energy prices rise, supply chains are disrupted, and industries worldwide face increased costs. Countries in Europe, Asia, and Latin America must scramble to secure alternative energy sources, often paying significantly more than they did before. This volatility demonstrates how a single country's mismanagement can create cascading effects, shaking financial systems and challenging governments far beyond its borders. Global investors are watching Venezuela closely. Hedge funds and multinational corporations track the country's oil production and political developments because instability can lead to speculative price surges in energy markets. Even minor disruptions in Venezuelan oil supply can have outsized effects on the international market. This has created a scenario where Venezuela's internal crisis now directly influences global energy pricing, inflation, and industrial costs. Simply put, what happens in Caracas does not stay in Caracas, it echoes across global economies. Sanctions play a critical, yet paradoxical role in this crisis. Measures imposed by the U.S. and Europe were intended to pressure the Venezuelan government, but their effects often exacerbate the nation's economic collapse. Restricted exports mean less national revenue, which further limits the government's ability to fund social programs or maintain infrastructure. International observers warn that sanctions, while politically motivated, indirectly deepen the oil trap, prolonging the suffering of ordinary Venezuelans and increasing uncertainty in global markets. Energy dependency is another global dimension of the Venezuelan crisis. Emerging economies like China and India, heavily reliant on imports, have been forced to adjust supply chains and seek alternative sources. Meanwhile, Russia and Middle Eastern nations gain leverage as suppliers in a volatile market, altering international alliances and trade dynamics. Venezuela's instability has transformed oil from a mere commodity into a geopolitical weapon, influencing not only Latin American politics but also global strategic positioning. The black market economy also has far-reaching consequences. As illegal oil networks expand, money laundering, smuggling, and corruption increasingly penetrate regional markets. These illicit networks not only undermine Venezuela's potential for economic recovery, but also pose risks to neighboring countries and international trade partners. Investors become wary of entering the Venezuelan market, while illegal actors exploit the chaos, perpetuating instability. Humanitarian concerns remain at the forefront of this crisis. Millions of Venezuelans have fled to Colombia, Brazil, and other neighboring nations, overwhelming healthcare, education, and housing systems. Refugee flows create social tensions and strain government resources. Organized crime networks exploit vulnerable populations, and regional political stability is increasingly threatened. Venezuela's internal collapse has thus evolved into a regional challenge, highlighting the intricate link between natural resources, governance, and human security. Infrastructure decay compounds the problem. Pipelines, refineries, and extraction facilities are outdated or damaged. Skilled labor has emigrated, leaving critical sectors understaffed. Even if oil reserves exist in abundance, extracting and processing them is now prohibitively expensive and technically challenging. Foreign investment is required to restore capacity, but political instability and corruption continue to deter potential investors. In practice, Venezuela's $5 trillion in oil reserves remains largely theoretical. The nation cannot transform this resource into tangible wealth without systemic reforms. Ironically, even as global oil prices rise, Venezuela cannot capitalize on this opportunity. Decades of mismanagement and short-sighted policies have ensured that oil wealth, once a potential engine for prosperity, now fuels corruption, black markets, and further instability. The country's natural resources, rather than lifting its population, trap it in a cycle of dependency, deprivation, and vulnerability. Looking ahead, the stakes remain high. Without immediate reforms, international cooperation, and long-term planning, Venezuela's collapse could deepen, with ramifications for generations to come. Infrastructure restoration, workforce rebuilding, and economic stabilization are long-term projects that cannot be accomplished overnight. Temporary measures may offer momentary relief, but they cannot reverse systemic failures. The $5 trillion oil trap is not merely a local issue, it is a multi-layered crisis, with social, economic, and geopolitical dimensions that will persist unless decisive action is taken. Venezuela's experience also serves as a warning to other resource-dependent nations. Dependence on a single commodity, without careful planning and investment in diversification, is a recipe for disaster. Short-term wealth can quickly turn into long-term instability. Natural resources, if mismanaged, can become a source of human suffering and political vulnerability rather than a driver of prosperity. The oil trap illustrates that resource. Abundance without responsible governance can have consequences that extend far beyond national borders. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into Venezuela's oil trap. The country's journey from wealth to crisis is a cautionary tale of what happens when natural resources are mismanaged. Political interests override long-term planning, and international pressures collide with domestic instability. If you found this analysis insightful, make sure to like this video, leave your comments, and subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to continue producing content that explores hidden histories, global crises, and economic mysteries like the one we just uncovered. By subscribing, you'll stay updated on the latest videos that shed light on the stories shaping our world.